Hi, my name is Pastor Hal York, and welcome to Truth in the Trenches. Today we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 25. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. As we've stated repeatedly, that chapters 5 through 7 deal with the dangers of sexual immorality, and chapter 7 almost exclusively deals with this. The writer winds up this three-chapter discussion with some warnings as well as some ways to avoid the alluring, seductive activity known as sexual immorality, which really is thrown at us from every direction in our society. And I think he sums up two key principles for overcoming this sin, or any sin for that matter. And I want to give you a quote that I think everyone should memorize and meditate upon in their Christian life. And then I want you to listen to the quote and think about it in the context of these three chapters on sexual sin. Here's the quote. I'm not sure who it's by, but I think it's an important one. What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. I think Solomon understood this. As we know back in chapter 4, he tells us to guard the heart with all diligence, for from it come the issues of life. When we lose the battle for the heart, the control center of our lives, we've lost the battle. Our wills and our minds are directed by our hearts, and will follow our hearts. What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. What happens in so many people's lives is they try to come up with all kinds of tricks and strategies to overcome temptation. But there are things that aim at the will and the mind, but they don't work or don't last, because ultimately the heart is going to overrule any lame or outward tricks to gain victory over sin, if that sin is loved or cherished in the heart. Why? Because what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. This means if we're going to win the battle over temptation, we need to be honest about what's going on in our hearts. And that's hard, because Jeremiah 17:9 says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? You see, it's one thing when we're asked by a counselor or a pastor if you're struggling with something it's one thing to say the right things when they ask the questions about your private life and your spiritual life. But often the answers that are given are from a mind that is trying to justify or protect a secret sin or habit that is cherished in the heart. I know I need to change a few things, but then they say, but not this or not that. And so any counsel they get will be useless. Well, I tried that and it didn't work. Well, of course it didn't work. How could it? Because the heart loves what, and the mind is justifying what the heart loves. That's why doctors don't let patients write their own prescriptions. They don't understand what the real problem is. Doctors most often do and know what is needed, even though it may not be thought to be needed by the patient, and it may not taste very good. But if I can give you a silly illustration of, imagine someone playing hockey, but they're frustrated. They just can't handle the puck or shoot with any accuracy or power. They'd love to be able to handle the puck better and shoot with more power. And so they ask you to watch them play. And it becomes quite apparent what the problem is as you watch. They are trying to play hockey with a golf club instead of a hockey stick. And so after the game, they come to you and say, so what do you think? Do you see any way I can improve my game? But then before you can answer, they say this, but there's only one thing I'm not going to give up, the golf club. Other than that, what else can I do to improve my game? What are they telling you? They're telling you they're not willing to give up the main reason they can't play well. And when it comes to the subject of porn addiction, for example, you hear this all the time. Watching it on their phone, on their computer, and they want help. But they begin by saying, but I can't give up my phone or the internet. They don't want to cut it off. They want to manage it and think they can manage it. Give me some ways I can manage this better. But you can't manage sin. You can't manage the outcome of sin, the consequences of sin. What the heart loves, it fights to keep. And you will never get victory over sexual sin until your heart is truly fallen in love with Jesus Christ. You love him more than anything else. And when you do, you will hate sin in the heart. Remember when John chapter 22, I think it was, or 21, when Jesus met Peter, had breakfast with him, then he takes him aside. This was after Peter denied Jesus. What did Jesus ask him? A simple question that everyone struggling with temptation needs to ask themselves. And it's this: do you love me? Jesus looked at Peter and says, do you love me? And he asked him that 3 times. When your heart loves Christ, it affects the will and your choices. And you do not stray into the path of sin or sexual temptation. You ponder the path of your feet and your mind, because your heart wants to be pure. Your heart longs to follow Christ and do what is honoring in His sight. And this is a battle we all face, and we all fall at different times. But as believers in Christ, we've been set free from the bondage of sin. We need to be reminded of that. Romans 6 states this over and over again. But if we're not serious about guarding the heart, choosing to be tempted and flirting with temptation, we are playing a dangerous game. And we do choose sometimes to tempt ourselves, don't we? What we're watching, what we're listening to, we're choosing to allow temptation to come into our life. We could just have turned it off and avoided it. But we're playing a dangerous game. And so Jesus talks about the radical choices sometimes we need to make. He says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. And he's not saying literally we do these things, but he's showing the radical steps we need to take and make in our lives if we're struggling, especially in the area of sexual sin. If you want to see this, read chapters 5 to 7 of Proverbs, and you'll see it very clearly. Paul, remember, told Timothy to flee youthful lusts. So Proverbs says, as he winds up this whole section on sexual immorality, do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. And remember, what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. When you find yourself starting to justify sin, you need to go back and say, what's going on in my heart? Do I love Christ the way I should? Have I truly been born again? Do I have a new heart? Yes, we all struggle, and we'll struggle until the day we see Christ face to face and we get a new body and we're made perfect, positionally as well as practically. But until that day, we need to be very, very careful and guard our hearts with all diligence, for from it flow the issues of life. And I'll say it one more time. For what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. May this truth guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live our lives for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.